affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir. State your name.
Mark Osterman?
And of course, you've testified before the court in this case before, correct?
Yes, sir. Last
I
week.
think you were placed under oath again, but you certainly acknowledge that you're still or are presently under oath as you testified before the jury.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I know that we don't go very far into your background, and I know that it was talked about before, but you are a federal air marshal?
I am.
Lived your life within the confines of law enforcement, is that correct? Okay. And you do know George Zimmerman, obviously.
I do.
What I'd like to focus your attention on a couple of subjects, first of which is any information you have regarding Mr. Zimmerman accomplishing a concealed weapons permit. Are you aware of that process?
I am.
And if you would, tell the jury what discussions you had with Mr. Zimmerman in that regard.
Objection calls for hearsay.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
In reference to the concealed weapons permit, we had talked about him getting a concealed weapons permit and how to go about it. There was a local sports store, I think it was Gander Mountain, that was putting on a class for the concealed weapons permit, and he had signed up for it, him and his wife, and they both took the class together, where it provided training and the actual fingerprinting and other things.
And did you have discussions with him about gun safety?
Often. We had gone to a shooting range on several occasions, probably 8 or 10 occasions, and each time firearm safety was always at the first or the top of our list of discussions.
And generally speaking, tell the jury what you mean by firearm safety.
Well, firearm safety at a range means always being safe and aware of where your firearm is being pointed, making sure that it's in a safe condition until you're ready to fire it, or if it's not being pointed in a direction that shouldn't be pointed, and just making sure that it's handled correctly. And George was very safe all the time.
And that was in part based upon your instruction to him?
That is possible.
And did you discuss with him the type of weapon to purchase and the purpose for it?
Yes, we did.
And if you would explain to the jury about that.
Well, there are many different types of firearms purposes. Some are for competition. If you wish to compete and travel and compete in firearms competitions, you would use a certain type of firearm for that. Some are for self-defense, and those would be a little more compact, a little smaller, able to keep on your person with a concealed weapons permit. Some, of course, would just be for, let's say, home defense, and they may be a little larger in size. But for the ones that you would have for personal defense, those would probably be the ones that I recommended George to get if he was going to get a concealed weapons permit. And the type of firearm that we chose was the Cal-Tec 9mm, and it was chosen for the reason of it didn't have an exterior safety. When you have an exterior safety on a firearm, sometimes it can be dangerous to the person who owns the firearm, such as if you need to use it in a very stressful situation, sometimes your mind will lock up a bit, will not allow you to think that extra step of pulling the safety down before you need to use it to defend yourself. So as most law enforcement agencies, or all that I'm aware of, they don't have an exterior safety on your firearm, which means there's no extra button to push. The only natural safety that you would have is an extended trigger pull. It means the trigger is not what people sometimes call a hair trigger. It's an extended trigger pull to where it can't be just accidentally squeezed and have the firearm go off.
What were the characteristics then of the Cal-Tec 9 that you focused on in assisting Mr. Zimmerman to purchase that weapon for self-defense?
It's a reliable firearm. It is without the exterior safety, and some firearms have 2 or 3 exterior types of safeties. I was not a fan of those, And so our discussion went to the type of firearm to where if you're, ironically enough, we had this discussion, if you're in a tussle with someone and you need to utilize firearms, there's a situation that's so stressful that you can't think to remove one or two exterior safeties, and you need to protect yourself, and you need to do it right now. The Kel-Tec was the type of weapon that was good for him.
I understand I'm not supposed to ask you what weapon you carry for work, so I won't. But can I ask you whether or not it has an external safety?
Every law enforcement job I've ever had, none have ever had an exterior safety.
And is the then extended trigger pull a safety choice for those type of firearms?
Absolutely, and that is by design.
Did you have any conversations with Mrs. Zimmerman as to how to keep the firearm, whether it be in a loaded position, unloaded position, or how that would be then ready for use if necessary?
I suggested that you keep one loaded in the chamber, because some people, if you're in your home and you have, let's say, children at your home, that obviously you should not have contact with it, but if an accident happens and it happens to be left somewhere, not having one in the chamber might be the smarter option, to where someone would actually have to manually manipulate the firearm, the automatic firearm, to put a round in the chamber to allow it to be fired. If you're in a situation where you're walking around day to day and you have it in a concealed weapons capacity, having one in the chamber is something that has to be done, because if you absolutely need to use it to protect someone else in society or yourself, that extra step sometimes is the difference between life and death.
Do you keep a round chambered in your gun?
All the time.
And do you know any law enforcement agencies that would suggest that that's inappropriate to do?
It's against policy
To
not have one in the chamber.
And did you have any discussions regarding having a full magazine after chambering one? And what's that concept?
Well, the suggestion I made to George was, we had talked about that and how he had heard that by not adding the extra the round in the magazine did something to the spring. It kind of maybe compressed the spring down too long, and maybe firearms that were made back in the 70s or 80s, the springs weren't made of as good a material, so the spring had what was known as a memory. But in today's firearms, especially with the Kel-Tec, there is no reason I can think of why you wouldn't, after loading a round into the chamber, why you wouldn't add another into the magazine in case you needed that. There's no reason why not to have that. To leave an extra available round not in your firearm just didn't seem to make sense.
And you've had an opportunity to be with Mr. Zimmerman when he was at the firing range?
Often.
What hand does he shoot his firearm with?
He shoots right-handed, I believe. But if I remember correctly, he's left-handed when he writes.
But his firearm, he shoots with. First of all, when you hold a firearm, obviously, do you use two hands if you can? And if so, which dominant hand would you use?
Well, the hand that squeezes the trigger would be the dominant hand, and I believed he was right-handed when he fired his firearm. And so the right hand would be holding the firearm, and then, of course, the right index finger is what pulls the trigger.
If there was evidence, and you may not be aware of it, of the gun being on his right side, what would be the normal process for removing the holster from the firearm to fire it?
Objection, this is speculation.
Sustained.
Do you know of any training which would suggest sort of the cross-body presentation, going across one side and bringing it out rather than going up and out? Are you aware of that?
Absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry.
What's the objection?
Relevance as to this case. Please not.
It's sustained.
Did you have discussions with Mr. Zimmerman as to how and where to maintain his firearm in a concealed way?
My discussions with him for anything firearm related like that was do what is comfortable, do what feels most natural, because if a stressful situation is thrust upon you, you're going to always go back to what feels natural and what you've trained with.
So is it then important in your discussions with Mr. Zimmerman that he have consistency in how he handles his firearm?
Absolutely.
Can you recall any time where you see Mr. Zimmerman use his left hand as a dominant hand for shooting a firearm?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
We practiced that. Sometimes if you're unable to shoot with your dominant hand, or the hand that you're most comfortable shooting with, shoot with the other hand. Sometimes you do it just for marksmanship practice, and sometimes you do it in case your primary dominant hand gets injured, your arm gets broken in some kind of event. You may need to use your left hand or the alternate hand for that reason.
And that would be used then as an alternative method of the use of the firearm?
Whichever hand can get to the firearm, that's the one you would use.
And as you testified before, you've known Mrs. Zimmerman for how long?
At least 5 years.
And I believe that your wife had met him first
She did.
through work.
She did.
Have you had an opportunity then to interact with Mr. Zimmerman over the past 5 years? I think you testified that he's your best friend, correct?
He is.
Have you heard his voice then in different varying situations or experiences?
I have.
And just an overview of sort of the different types of voice, conversational, laughing, whatever it might be, as sort of the spectrum of what you've heard Mrs. Zimmerman and his voice sound like.
Quite a bit. Quite wide in the spectrum.
Okay, can you give us any examples?
Well, anywhere from the casual conversation to the hysterical laugh, to perhaps shouts over long distance. Someone's downrange at the shooting range, or someone is at the other side of a store and yelling to each other, but perhaps not what I had heard on the 911 tapes.
Let's talk about that for a minute. If I might play for you a tape, I believe it's 158. I'm getting that right? Yes. May I play that exhibit at this point? I'm going to play an exhibit for you, which I think you reference as the 911 call, and ask first that you listen through it throughout. If you need to hear it a second time, let me know. If you need me to go back and listen to a portion, let me know. But I'm going to play it straight through one time.
911, do you need police, fire, medical?
Maybe both. I'm not sure. There's just someone screaming outside.
Okay, what's the address that they're near?
1211 Twin Trees Lane.
Twin Trees Lane? Is this in the Twin Lake Town homes in Sanford?
Yes.
Okay, and is it a male or female?
It sounds like a male.
And you don't know why?
I don't know why. I think they're yelling help, but I don't know. Just send someone quick, please.
Okay. Does he look hurt to you?
I can't see him. I don't want to go out there. I don't know what's going on. So they're sending.
So you think he's yelling help?
Yes.
All right, what is your phone number?
Just there's gunshots.
I'm going to stop at that point. Have you listened to the tape throughout the end of it at any point?
I have.
Any relevance of the rest of the tape as far as your ability to hear George's voice?
No, sir.
Okay. Then let me focus on what we have heard and tell the jury, first of all, if you have an opinion as to whose voice that is in the background, and by that I mean not who we now know to be Miss Lauer talking to the 911 operator, but the screaming or the noise in the background. Do you have an opinion whose voice that is?
I thought it was George.
Okay. And tell me why you think that.
Just the tone, just the volume and the tone of what I was hearing was something that, because I talked to him probably as much on the phone, or had before this incident, as I did in person. So hearing his voice over a recording is something that your tone's a little different, and it just sounds a little different over a phone, and it just sounded like George.
Okay. I might have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, ma'am.
question or two, just concerning the decision regarding the Caltech. Can you explain to the jury your understanding of double action versus single action guns?
Of course. A firearm that has double action requires the trigger and the hammer to do two separate things, two separate motions. One is as you're squeezing the trigger, the hammer was in front, was forward. It has to come back. That's the one action, and then it comes forward and fires the firing pin, which sets off the firearm. A single action would mean the firearm is, the hammer mechanism is back, and as you squeeze the trigger, it does one action, which is single. Now, there are some automatic handguns that are single action, double action only, to where internally the hammer is internal, so you really can't see the hammer coming back, but both functions are done in the double action capacity.
And is a Caltech 9 the type firearm where it could only be double action?
Correct. That's what makes the extra trigger squeeze even harder, and it's more of a firm squeeze, making it less likely to go off by accident.
And is that one of the safety features of that gun?
It's its greatest safety feature.
Thank you. Nothing further on.
Thank you, Cross.
Good morning, Mr. Osterman.
And good morning, sir.
I think we briefly talked about the book last time. You did write a book with your wife, right?
Correct.
And all the proceeds are going on behalf of George Zimmerman, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. How many books have been sold so far?
I'm not sure. Tate Publishing would probably know best.
Okay.
They would probably give us the best number.
But whatever money has been obtained so far, you're setting it aside for the defendant George Zimmerman, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You were asked, I guess, at the very end about the knowledge of the gun that you suggested to Mr. Zimmerman, correct, the defendant?
Correct.
Okay. Do you know what the trigger pull is on that gun?
The pounds per square inch, is that what
Yeah.
you're referring?
Yeah.
I do not know.
Would you agree that an expert with firearms would be better suited to explain the mechanics of that and the trigger pull and all that stuff?
Without question.
You're not here testifying as a firearms expert,
I am
right?
not.
Okay, I just want to make sure the record was clear about that.
Correct.
But you did state that you did have discussions with the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, regarding what type of gun he should have, and I think you taught him how to shoot, correct? It's my recollection, right?
He had been shooting at a range before. His father was career military, so I was not his first time going to a shooting range.
But you made him a better shooter.
I hope so.
Okay. And you mentioned in terms of discussions with him in terms of the firearm, what to get.
Yes,
He
sir.
never conferred with you as the type of holster to get, correct?
He did not.
Right? I mean, the holster he got on his own, correct?
Correct.
And did he ever show it to you once he got it?
Oh, yes.
That it was an internal holster,
Correct.
right? And an internal means you can hide it inside your waistband versus an external, which is what the police would have if they're in uniform, et cetera. Correct?
Absolutely.
Is that the difference?
That is correct.
Okay. So it'd be hard to see. In other words, internally, people would be having a hard time seeing it.
Correct.
That's the whole purpose.
Even without a jacket, that would be difficult to see.
Okay. And if it was dark, it would be even harder to see, correct?
I would agree.
Okay. And you were talking about techniques in terms of shooting the gun and all that, in terms of shooting. I gather when you were shooting with him, in terms of you shoot at a target, you shoot to aim to kill, correct?
You aim center mass, center of the target.
Center mass, meaning the heart, the torso, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
And you keep shooting until the threat is gone. In other words, if the person's still alive and all that, you keep shooting until the threat is gone, correct?
Well, it's not so much as if the person is still alive, it's until the threat is neutralized.
Right. In other words, you would never holster your gun if the person was still alive and was a threat to you, correct?
Well, I disagree with that.
You would?
I would disagree. My thought would be that the minute let's say someone was a threat to me with a knife or a firearm, even if they had the knife in their hand, but they surrendered and went and started following my instructions, I would consider them neutralized.
Okay. In that scenario, if they're still a threat, you would keep shooting, correct?
Not if they're not aggressively harming you.
Okay, so you would holster the gun if you felt the person had a firearm still?
I have enough confidence to know that I might be able to retrieve it fast enough if they jump back at me.
You're saying that you shoot somebody and you still feel they have a gun and they're going for the gun, that you would holster your gun?
Not if they're going after my gun. No.
If you believe they have a gun or they have some type of weapon.
If their hands are free,
Yeah, if you can't see their hands,
oh, then I would keep the firearm out.
you would keep the firearm pointed at the person, right?
Probably.
Or shoot because you thought it was a threat.
You'd only shoot if you felt the actual threat of a firearm. So if
Okay.
firearm pointing in your direction, then you would fire again until it's neutralized.
So let's make sure the question's clear. In other words, if you feel the person has some kind of weapon, you would not holster your gun, correct?
It would depend.
If you can't see the person's hands and you believe they have some kind of weapon, you would not holster your gun.
It would depend. It would depend on the type of weapon.
Okay, well, if you can't tell it what type of weapon they have, but you believe they have some kind of weapon, they're a threat to you, would you holster your gun?
Well, I'm a person that would give police commands and give that kind of commanding presence, and if someone's not obeying the commands right on the heels of a very stressful and physical confrontation, I would probably keep the firearm out. That may be what I would do with the training I've had.
Yes, sir. And you talked about the gun in terms of how many rounds, and I guess technically people refer to as bullets, but you know it's actually referred to as a round, and then
Correct.
the bullet is the part that comes out of the gun, right? So just make sure the jury
Good
understands.
distinction.
Okay, and you got the cartridge, et cetera, and you got
Correct.
the gunpowder. But you're saying that you would fully load and have one in the chamber already,
Always.
right?
There's no reason not
Now,
to.
You're saying that that's per policy. You're talking about police officers.
Police officer policy in every department I've ever
Right.
worked
Now,
with.
there is a distinction. You're not telling every citizen is when they get a permit, they're told automatically that they have to have
Absolutely
a gun in the chamber.
Not at all.
You're talking about police officers.
Correct.
There's a difference, right?
I agree.
Now, you're talking about in terms of scenarios that you discussed with the defendant.
Yes.
You were asked about that. If you shot at somebody, right, and you didn't realize whether you had shot him or not, and the person said give up, what would you do if they still were a threat to you?
If they were still a threat,
Yeah, would you shoot him then?
could you define what the threat might be?
Well, I'm just talking about what the scenarios you discussed with the defendant.
Well, what we discussed was if they're a threat, let's say someone lays down on the ground and follows your commands, say you tell them to freeze, get down to their knees, lay down on the ground, you're not a threat at that point. At that point, I would probably try to restrain them.
Okay, and so you discussed with him in terms of taking somebody, in terms of arresting them or getting them under control, correct?
If we did, it was something I wouldn't have remembered the specifics of it. He would not have needed to know how to arrest somebody or how to restrain someone. It was basically if someone is a threat to yourself or to someone in the general public, you keep the firearm out if they're an active threat.
That Cal-Tech gun that we talked about, when you fire it, you intend that bullet to go out the gun, right, out the barrel, right? There's no you don't kind of in the movie, squeeze the trigger a little bit. When you're squeezing, you're intending for that bullet to go out, correct?
Right. Correct.
And make sure the record's clear now, you're not saying that Mr. Zimmerman was a law enforcement officer.
Not at all.
Okay. Unlike you, obviously. There's a
Correct.
difference, right?
I agree.
Wouldn't you agree?
100%.
A big difference
I agree.
in terms of what police officers can do and what a citizen can do.
The authority is
Right.
much different. Correct.
And I'm assuming if in terms of the scenarios you discussed with them, if you're confronting a person, in other words, and they're saying they're giving up, they're backing up, you don't shoot them, right?
Correct.
I'm assuming. Or do you? Does the police teach you to shoot them?
No.
Okay. You mentioned about left-handed, right-handed. Did you say that he had shot the gun left-handed? Did I understand
we
you
had
correctly?
practiced both.
So he was proficient in shooting it left-handed, but right was his dominant hand?
Proficient is a relative word.
Could he pull the trigger and hit the target?
Absolutely. I wouldn't consider that proficient. It's just familiar.
Okay, so he could shoot the gun and hit the target with his left hand.
Left or right-handed.
Okay. But he was better right-handed than left-handed. Would that be fair?
I thought so.
Okay. I don't have a moment, Your Honor. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Just so we're clear with the different authority with police officers and citizens, in order for a gun to be available for self-defense, it has to be ready to fire, correct?
Always. I would highly recommend that.
So if you were asked by anybody, including Mrs. Zimmerman, how to keep a gun so that it, if necessary, it's available for self-defense, what would you tell them about chambering a load or not?
Putting a round in the chamber and then what is called topping off the magazine, because the magazine is where the bullets are. As you place that into an automatic handgun, you take one off the top and it goes into the chamber. Well, I would recommend removing the magazine, putting one more bullet into the magazine, putting it back in there, because it's always better to have it, not need it, than need it and not have it.
And that goes not only for law enforcement that you're more familiar with, but for citizens as well, correct?
My wife has a concealed weapons permit and I instruct her the same way.
When you say the training for firearms includes focusing on center of mass, what does that mean?
Firearms at the range, to shoot firearms at a target, at a paper target, is difficult. It's almost like a golf swing where you need to do many things correctly, and if any one of them isn't correct, then you're off of your target. So you try to concentrate on doing everything correctly. But in a stressful situation, to aim at a particular point, such as, I guess in Hollywood they sometimes shoot for the shoulder or something of that nature. That is such a small area that if you feel threatened, you aim for the largest area that you can get to stop the threat, to remove the threat.
And is there any training from your experience that if you're going to do that, that you shoot more than once, or that you shoot rapid succession, or how is that handled?
We have that training. They also train that type of technique at concealed weapons permit classes to fire more than once, either the 2-shot or the 3-shot. It depends on the scenario, depends on the situation. It would depend on whether you have multiple assailants that are threatening you, something to that effect.
What's then the purpose for shooting more than once and going for center of mass?
Well, if you have a smaller caliber handgun, the impact of the projectile isn't as great. If you have a rather large person, someone over 6'5" or something, very heavy in their weight, shooting a smaller caliber bullet may not have the same effect to stop them. Someone who is also perhaps under a narcotic that is enhancing their strength, sometimes firing once may not stop them from being a threat, and they may continue to attack.
We had talked, you had talked with Mr. De Leonda about the internal holster, that you were not there when that was chosen?
Correct.
Correct. But that you've seen it?
I have.
Is there something sinister or improper in your mind about an internal holster?
No, it's comfort. You wear what is comfortable to you, and you wear what is what's going to be effective. You don't. There's some holsters that some people will get that are more for show, but they're kind of difficult to remove the firearm. And sometimes you see that at a shooting range where someone is trying to get their firearm out of the holster, and it's a struggle. Always go with what's comfortable and what's functional. So
just so we're clear, if I had a holster with the gun, the internal holster has the gun. If my fingers are the gun, the internal holster, if I might approach the witness for a moment, the internal holster sort of holds the gun in here, correct?
I would think, yes.
Hidden from view, correct?
It's designed, correct.
In effect, concealed.
Yes.
The purpose of a concealed weapons permit is to allow you to do what?
Is to make sure no one can see it. I think that's the law of Florida's concealed weapons permit, is not to carry it open.
Because carrying one external would have it like this, correct?
You would be required then to have a jacket or some
Right.
kind of cover.
So that if I had an external holster like this might be legal, correct?
I would agree.
This wouldn't be legal, would it?
That would be a violation.
And this certainly would not be legal.
Absolutely not.
But with an internal holster, I might get away with having a legal carry as long as the gun was not visible.
Correct.
Thank you, Your Honor. Nothing further.
Thank you.
Very briefly, Your Honor. You mentioned in terms of that you shoot more than once, it's called a double tap, I believe, right?
Yes, sir, it is.
In terms of if the threat is still existing, you're shooting not just once, you're shooting twice or 3 times, however many times, correct?
Correct.
And normally it's twice.
Well, we practice that
All right.
over and over.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. May Mr. Osterman be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, sir. You are excused. Call your next witness, please.
Yes, subject to recall, Your Honor.
You're subject to being recalled, sir.
Defense Attorney Russo, Your Honor. Air Marshal,
I am.
lived your life within the confines of law enforcement, is that
I
correct? Okay. And you do know George Zimmerman, obviously.
I do.
What I'd like to focus your attention on a couple of subjects, first of which is any information you have regarding Mr. Zimmerman accomplishing a concealed weapons permit. Are you aware of that process?
I am.
And if you would, tell the jury what discussions you had with Mr. Zimmerman in that regard.
Objection calls for hearsay.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
In reference to the concealed weapons permit, we had talked about him getting a concealed weapons permit and how to go about it. There was a local sports store, I think it was Gander Mountain, that was putting on a class for the concealed weapons permit, and he had signed up for it, him and his wife, and they both took the class together, where it provided training and the actual fingerprinting and other things.
And did you have discussions with him about gun safety?
Often. We had gone to a shooting range on several occasions, probably 8 or 10 occasions, and each time firearm safety was always at the first or the top of our list of discussions.
And generally speaking, tell the jury what you mean by firearm safety.
Well, firearm safety at a range means always being safe and aware of where your firearm is being pointed, making sure that it's in a safe condition until you're ready to fire it, or if it's not being pointed in a direction that shouldn't be pointed, and just making sure that it's handled correctly. And George was very safe all the time.
And that was in part based upon your instruction to him?
That is possible.
And did you discuss with him the type of weapon to purchase and the purpose for it?
Yes, we did.
And if you would explain to the jury about that.
Well, there are many different types of firearms purposes. Some are for competition. If you wish to compete and travel and compete in firearms competitions, you would use a certain type of firearm for that. Some are for self-defense, and those would be a little more compact, a little smaller, able to keep on your person with a concealed weapons permit. Some, of course, would just be for, let's say, home defense, and they may be a little larger in size. But for the ones that you would have for personal defense, those would probably be the ones that I recommended George to get if he was going to get a concealed weapons permit. And the type of firearm that we chose was the Cal-Tec 9mm, and it was chosen for the reason of it didn't have an exterior safety. When you have an exterior safety on a firearm, sometimes it can be dangerous to the person who owns the firearm, such as if you need to use it in a very stressful situation, sometimes your mind will lock up a bit, will not allow you to think that extra step of pulling the safety down before you need to use it to defend yourself. So as most law enforcement agencies, or all that I'm aware of, they don't have an exterior safety on your firearm, which means there's no extra button to push. The only natural safety that you would have is an extended trigger pull. It means the trigger is not what people sometimes call a hair trigger. It's an extended trigger pull to where it can't be just accidentally squeezed and have the firearm go off.
What were the characteristics then of the Cal-Tec 9 that you focused on in assisting Mr. Zimmerman to purchase that weapon for self-defense?
It's a reliable firearm. It is without the exterior.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir. State your name.
Mark Osterman?
And of course, you've testified before the court in this case before, correct?
Yes, sir. Last
I
week.
think you were placed under oath again, but you certainly acknowledge that you're still or are presently under oath as you testified before the jury.
Yes, sir.
And I know that we don't go very far into your background, and I know that it was talked about before, but you are a federal